How we doing today, Planet Earth? My name is Ian Fox, and today I wanted to talk about gaming as a whole, because as time has gone on, particularly in just the last handful of years, my mindset on the hobby has slowly begun to shift into something that feels a bit more negative than it used to. Now, I want to be clear that when I say that, I don't mean that I don't like to play video games anymore, because that would just be an outright lie. As a hobby, I still very much love to play my video games, and I still do fairly often, but the overall feeling of engaging in this hobby doesn't feel as great nor as exciting as it once did. There are a few factors that play into this, which we will get into in this video, but one that has less to do with the industry as a whole and more with just life and time going by is probably the most obvious and relatable. As of right now, as I record the commentary for this video, I am pushing 25 years old, so needless to say, I am not a kid anymore. I am a grown-ass man with responsibilities that I did not have when I was younger, like bills and such, right alongside a lot of the people that I not only grew up with, but would spend a lot of time playing games with in the past. As we get older, one of the things that becomes apparent to you is how hard it can be to get people together because we're so busy spending our days on much more important things like going about our lives working, spending time with our families, wives, girlfriends, whatever. Because of life, it can be hard to gather people together, like I said, so at least in my case, more often than not, I don't have anybody online or have any friends that are available at that exact moment to get online. That's not to say it doesn't happen, of course, because I'm sure many of you out there who can relate to what I'm saying still have those nights where you are able to get all of the boys or girls online and can slay bugs and take shots together in the name of managed democracy. Those nights are still the shit and typically culminate in a pretty good buzz and some good laughs, but they are usually pretty few and far between these days. Especially when you have friends like mine that would rather get everyone together over some drinks in a more social setting, which, gotta say, is a pretty solid alternative. The downtime in between those kinds of sessions are much less fun to me now, and as a result, I've noticed that I don't really find myself enjoying multiplayer games all that much these days. Pretty much as a whole, games where multiplayer is a main draw aren't as desirable to me as they used to be. I'm sure many of you at some point of your life have heard that your taste buds change every 7 years or so, which is something that is exaggerated, but it is a real thing and directly leads to how your sense of taste changes throughout your life. When this happens, this directly changes your taste to evolve in any way in between liking things that you used to not like or disliking things that you used to really like. When I've talked about this topic with some of my gaming buddies before, I started to use the term gaming taste buds because as I've gotten older and the factors of life that I mentioned before became more apparent, I have found myself moving towards primarily single-player games whenever I do feel like playing something. It's not like I didn't play single-player games before this shift, as there are many franchises that are predominantly single-player focused that I have loved for a very long time, but when I was a bit younger, I usually found myself gravitating towards games where I could play alongside my friends. As this shift in interest began to happen, I started to get into quite a lot of other titles that I hadn't paid much mind to before, like Cuphead, for example, which didn't feel anything at all like I've played before with its 1930s animation style and challenging platformer gameplay. I also got heavily into Fallout 3, and man, that sent me down a rabbit hole with the other games in the series that I could not pull myself out of for literal weeks. I did try Elden Ring, though I very quickly figured out that it wasn't for me, even though I do think it is a very high quality title that is well deserving of all of its success. I even got into a game called Stray, where you literally just play as a cat in a post-apocalyptic world, and it ended up being a really fun experience. If you had asked me 5 years ago if I wanted to play a single-player game where you play as a cat, I wouldn't have even bothered to consider it, or many of the other games that I haven't even mentioned. The lack of interest in multiplayer games has definitely broadened my horizons in terms of single-player games that I really enjoy that I didn't think I'd ever feel were worth my time. So, despite the fact that multiplayer games just don't really feel the same to me anymore, there is a little bit of a silver lining there.
This is brilliant, but I like this.
Something else that has really put a damper on my love for not just multiplayer games, but single player as well, is the general greed that has plagued this industry for a very long time, but in recent years has only gotten so much worse. The thing is, even though I've grown to prefer single-player games, whenever a new game is releasing, regardless of whether it be a multiplayer or single-player dominated game, I try to look at every single release with a lot of speculation and a highly cautious attitude, because these days you can't trust any company to give a shit about the people that consume their products. It feels almost impossible to get excited about any new game that is coming out because of how often many of the famous gaming conglomerates have knowingly screwed over the customer because they wanted to make a quick buck and or couldn't just wait a little bit longer to collect on the sales that they estimate a hyped up game is going to bring in. I can't even tell you how many games have come out only in recent years where a game is marketed to be this great experience that you can't miss out on, but then when it actually comes out, it's broken as fuck to the point where it's pretty much unplayable. Cyberpunk 2077 is the perfect example of this. This title was hyped up beyond belief and was delayed multiple times in order to supposedly allow for more time for the developers at CD Projekt Red to polish up the game so that it could be ready for release. Then it came out, and it turned out that the game was still nowhere near ready, and those delays didn't happen because the game just needed more polish. They happened because the game just straight up wasn't finished. But even after those delays, the suits over at CD Projekt Red were well aware that the game still needed more time in the oven, but forced the devs to push it out the door anyway because the investors wanted their money and they wanted it now. The customers that purchased the game were stuck with an unplayable game for over 2 years, while the devs spent the time they should have had to develop the game after launch working to fix it up. This ultimately took away from the time that could have been spent making the free DLCs that were promised when CD Projekt Red came out with their apology for their unfinished game that they pretended they didn't know wasn't finished despite being the people that made it. As a result, the game never got those free DLCs. Though it did get the Phantom Liberty expansion that cost an additional $30 when it came out. Keep in mind, despite the fact that CD Projekt Red fucked their customers, it came out later that all of the refunding that they had to do barely affected the company's bottom line at all. This meant that releasing an unfinished game pretty much proved to be the right move for them financially. I didn't buy into Cyberpunk 2077 when it came out, and to this day I still haven't played it, despite it supposedly having made a comeback and hearing that it's now a pretty great game, because in the back of my mind I remember what it represented when it came out, and I still have a hard time looking past that when it comes to a controversy like this. Speaking of hyped games that screwed over their customers, one of the most recent controversies that actually sparked the idea to make this video is how Aspyr handled the Battlefront Classic Collection. This has to easily be the most blatant example of what's wrong with this industry in this day and age, because Aspyr took the beloved original Star Wars Battlefront games from 2004 and 2005 and somehow managed to re-release them as a lower quality product than they were when they came out all those years ago for a highly questionable price. I loved playing both of those games as a little Ian Fox, and when I heard that these two games were getting a re-release for modern consoles with a rejuvenated multiplayer, I was actually a little hyped about it despite the price tag. Yes! Back in the day, I was playing these games on the PS2, and even though they had a multiplayer mode back then, I didn't know that playing with others online was even possible, so I only ever really played it with bots or split screen with my older brother. When I heard about it, I was telling everybody I know that plays games that we needed to pick this up when it came out, because we could all play these classic games together in massive 64-player battles. These are old games, so I felt like it was a pretty safe bet that this was going to be a good experience getting to play them again in a whole new way, but like so many others, I would come to find out that I was yet again putting too much faith in the suits of the gaming industry. The Battlefront collection launched only like a month or so after being announced, and when it launched, it seemed like Aspyr had only started working on it the same day it was announced, because they somehow managed to break two over 20-year-old games.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.
Luckily, I didn't end up picking it up on day one, and I very quickly began hearing about how the game ran poorly and how it lacks content that was present in the original releases, how Aspyr straight up removed cutscenes in the campaign that are vital to understanding the actual story for some reason. There was even a widespread issue where the audio would glitch out really frequently, and the multiplayer was nearly unplayable on all platforms for a variety of reasons. For games that are as old as these two are, interest in this re-release was going to be limited, meaning the rejuvenated online modes were only going to stay populated for some time, especially since the collection for some reason doesn't have crossplay, only further limiting the player count of the multiplayer. The mass amount of refunds that followed dwindled the multiplayer population even further, so once I started to hear about how it was now even harder to find games than it already was, the collection's biggest selling point for me became moot. Aspyr took a page out of the books of so many who have botched a release before them and made a public apology about how they didn't foresee their unpolished games that only they were working on were going to be unpolished when they came out, and how they were thankful for the support they were getting from the Star Wars community, despite them actually receiving no real support because everybody was just angry at them because they could obviously tell that they were being greedy. Really, there is no excuse for taking games that are over 20 years old and somehow making them worse. These games were already finished decades ago, and they somehow managed to make them incomplete. I really do wish that I could say that I don't understand how something like this could happen, but I can't, because simply the reason is greed.
You can't keep getting away with it!
Quick PSA for anyone out there that is watching this video and still wants to try these really old games for some reason, buy the versions that are on Steam. They go for only like 10 bucks each, totaling $20 instead of $35, but very frequently go on sale for much, much less. I think I remember picking them up for like $2 a pop during one sale, so if you do want to try these games, just be patient and pick them up for extremely cheap. You have my word that these versions are actually quality products and great games, even though they are a little dated. A game that is definitely a lot newer is The Last of Us Part 1, a remake of the critically acclaimed title that was released on the PS3 back in 2013 and remastered in 2014 for the PS4. Personally, I love The Last of Us. I loved the remaster when I played that for the first time, and I picked up the PS5 remake on the same day that I picked up my PS5, and just like the original game, it is a great single-player experience that I would recommend to anyone with a PlayStation that hasn't played the game. The thing is, since this game is a PlayStation exclusive, it has been added to the growing list of titles that Sony has been working to port over to PC for sale on Steam. Even though the remake was kinda controversial because it's debatable on whether the original really needed a remake, it's still a great game. But when it was released in March of 2023 on Steam, it was a terrible port, making for it a terrible product. It cost a full $60 on release, which is to be expected for a game like this, but what was not expected was that once people bought the game, it was broken beyond belief. Those that made the purchase would find that the game had major frame rate issues, would crash constantly, the game's graphics would look like this pretty regularly, and overall was completely broken and largely unplayable. I'm sure by now you're recognizing a pattern here, but when the outcry became loud enough, Naughty Dog released a statement where they actually didn't bother apologizing because they knew that this would happen. But what they did say was that they know many players aren't experiencing the level of Naughty Dog quality that is to be expected, and they are currently working to get the game to a state where it does meet those expectations of quality. If only they had taken the time to actually reach that level of quality before they released the game, but this was around the same time that The Last of Us on HBO had come out, so they wanted to cash in on the buzz that was surrounding the TV show at the time. A lot like Cyberpunk 2077, The Last of Us Part 1 on PC is apparently in a pretty good state now, as the reviews on Steam are mostly positive, but upon release, like so many others, it became just another example of how the rotten cancer that is greed ravages this industry like the plague. I know that I've only gone in depth with 3 examples of games launching in a broken and unplayable state, but what everyone needs to keep in mind is, this is only 3 occasions out of hundreds of games that have launched this way, and the correct number for how many times this should have happened at all is 0. Never knowing whether or not I should get excited for a game really puts a drag on my outlook on this hobby, because there really isn't anything to be excited about or look forward to. It doesn't matter who is developing the game that you want or who is publishing it. What I have learned over the years is that no developer or publisher is truly opposed to rushing a product out the door before it is ready or finding other ways to be greedy. Alongside an unfinished game on launch, another of the biggest issues that gaming suffers from nowadays is how the games we love are monetized. I'm going to point the finger at Fortnite for a second here because I feel that it is single-handedly the reason games are monetized the way that they are now.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Sometime around 2016 or 17, the gaming industry started to make a shift away from selling DLC as individual expansion packs or bundled season passes and moved into what we now know as the live service model. I'm not even going to bother trying to minimize how much I despise this business model. Games as a service that the industry runs on nowadays has, in my opinion, hurt the quality of many of the games that used to be really good before they switched over to this newer money-making scheme. First off, the whole idea of a live service is a company asking you to buy into a game at full price with the promise that they will provide more content for you in the future at no extra charge. A big part of this is that while they are promising extra content, they're only legally obligated to provide what they have outright told you that you are going to receive. With that being said, that's really what you're buying, a promise. The thing is, the companies you are buying said game from only intend to come through on the promises that they've sold to you if their game sells well. If a game they're trying to sell doesn't perform as well as the suits were hoping, you can bet your ass that the live service for that game is only going to last as long as the company feels is necessary, so that way they don't get sued into oblivion for false advertising. This means that the content support players might expect for a game will not only get cut short, but the amount of content will most definitely be cut down as well. Battlefield 2042 is a great example of this because when it launched in 2021, it was completely unplayable because of how broken it was. Naturally, the game didn't perform as well, so the big brain suits at EA figured that the lower than expected sales numbers were due to a general lack of interest in the game instead of it not being a functional product. There was a lot of talk at the time about what might come of the live service, as EA clearly would have loved to just step away completely, but they had promised up to 4 seasons worth of content with the year 1 pass that was bundled with some additions of the game. They ultimately did deliver on those seasons and then some, as the live service for 2042 concluded with the release of its 7th season pretty recently, but during all that time, they only released a total of 7 maps over the course of its run. That's a single map every 3 months per season. Keep in mind, a big part of the marketing for the game was for Portal Mode, which was supposed to be where past games like Battlefield 1942, Bad Company 2, and Battlefield 3 could come together, and they said that they planned to expand on this mode with more remastered maps from the franchise that the fans had come to love. Because of the way the game launched, the developers at DICE had to spend their time unfucking the game, so needless to say, there was never a single remastered map added to the game like they said that there would be. I don't even think it was ever addressed either. The developers just pretended this huge chunk of the game that was the biggest selling point for many like it never even existed. Let's compare those 7 maps added to 2042 over the course of 3 years to the 20 maps that were added to Battlefield 4 in less than 1 year. Now I get it, you might be thinking, these maps from Battlefield 4 are all paid for either individually as expansions or bundled in the Premium Pass, which was an additional $50 when it came out. That would be 100% correct, and the premium price of $50 additional still manages to be the better deal. Let me explain. With 2042's live service, we get 7 maps as well as broken promises. If you were to spend that $50 in 2042 on cosmetics, you'd be spending up to $30 for some cosmetic bundles and up to $10 a pop for an individual character skin. Think about that for a second. What sounds like more value for your money to you? 20 new multiplayer maps for $50 or 5 individual character skins for $50? This is the modern live service model, ladies and gentlemen. More for less. I understand the possibility that what I am about to say may end up being a hot take, but I never minded paying that $50 for a season pass. As a matter of fact, I think the whole paid DLC route was a much healthier business model for the players and the industry as a whole. The good thing about a premium pass style monetization scheme is that dropping $50 is basically like EA signing a contract. They told us what we could expect if the customer decided the price was worth it, and if the purchase was made, they would be legally obligated to deliver all of it. At least when I dropped $50 for Battlefield Premium, I knew that I was going to get a lot of content to come with it, like maps, dozens of new guns, and even unlockable cosmetics to be added as well. Nowadays, if you drop $10, $20, or even $30 on a cosmetic, that's all you're getting, a cosmetic. This is only Battlefield 2042. It seems that every new multiplayer game that comes out these days is modeled this way, and people are just accustomed to it now. It often doesn't just affect the amount of content you're provided with either, as this monetization scheme has directly affected how games look and ultimately feel when you play them. To prove my point here, I really don't need to do anything more than show you what Call of Duty looks like these days. I'm sure many of you out there remember playing World at War multiplayer, which is world famous for its gritty and often horror-like depiction of World War II, where the universe is incredibly immersive.
Yes.
Maybe you remember playing the original Modern Warfare 2 and getting hooked into the world not only because the gameplay was fun, but because it felt like a proper war game. Call of Duty these days is nothing like this. Instead of proper factions where there are supposed to be soldiers in a war zone, we have whatever the fuck this is. There just isn't anything here that you would ever expect to see in an actual war zone. So many of these overpriced cosmetics have the most out-of-pocket designs that look like they actually took some effort to come up with. What makes this hilariously ironic to me is that you can see the effort that goes into these designs, yet it's very rare for an operator to actually get a skin that looks like something you'd see in a military. There are countless cosmetics in every new COD game that totally ruin any level of immersion or atmosphere that it could have had, making the series overall feel soulless. What is there to really distinguish the multiplayer component of each COD for the last few years if it all just looks like this? Look at this shit. You can be Nicki Minaj in Modern Warfare 2, or Snoop Dogg in Vanguard. I was hanging out with my dad the other day watching him play Modern Warfare 3, and we both laughed out loud when we saw that they added Cheech and Chong skins. It's really not just COD though. A lot of games are suffering from this, like the last couple Battlefield games really had an identity crisis because they wanted to sell wacky cosmetics in an effort to rack in the dough even when it conflicted with the gritty atmospheres they wanted to portray. I know that Halo Infinite's community isn't really happy about a lot of the cosmetic designs in the game because they feel that many of them don't really look like anything that would exist in that universe. Another thing that I find ironic is that I recently started playing Counter-Strike 2 for the first time not too long ago, and that game is infamous for its controversies in regards to its skins, but it still manages to have almost every team looking like a member of their respective factions, allowing for some level of immersion. When I think about this problem that the industry has these days with over-monetizing their games to the point that they all pretty much lack the atmospheres and immersion they were once known for, I can't help but think back on popular games like Battlefield 1, which would not have been anywhere near as highly regarded as it is were it not for its incredibly unique setting and atmosphere. When you have a game where the developers are allowed to create and care about immersion, you end up with titles like Battlefield 1. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to this overall topic is the $70 price tag on games. This was a completely unnecessary $10 bump in price that comes down to no other reason for happening other than, you guessed it, greed. The excuse that publishers chose was that games are more expensive than ever to make for the next generation, so the bump in price was necessary to offset the development cost. Considering that because of the other things we've discussed here in this video, all of these same companies are richer than ever and the industry as a whole is more profitable than it has ever been, I am going to outright say this is a lie for a few reasons. For one, the standard retail price was bumped up from $60 to $70 for no reason other than they thought they could get away with it, so they tried it and it worked. This was already a known fact just because it's pretty easy to see through the corporate bullshit, but if anyone still doubted that this was true, Nintendo proved it when they bumped up the price on Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom from $60 to $70 even though it was developed for a system released on the previous generation. simply because the rest of the industry proved that customers would be willing to pay that price anyway. Secondly, because of the way most games are monetized, they get to put less money into creating quote-unquote free content for them, so they can put as minimal effort and resources into creating overpriced cosmetics that will bring in loads of money. And lastly, it's just another way the publishers can get more for giving less. We all know what it's like for a full-price game to come out and see it end up lacking content, leaving the players starving for more if they enjoy the game. The rise in price only hurts even more when you take into account everything we've talked about so far. It's just a constant cycle of games launching very often before they're ready, and then the promise we are sold gets cut short and often under-delivers, but these companies still come out on top because you've got all the smooth brains out there who just dump money on overpriced skins, which makes them more money, and in turn telling them that this is what works. It's really a shame. I know that this video has been very negative, and like I said, I still love gaming and engaging in this hobby all the time, but the route that it has taken because of the executives at the top has most definitely hampered my enjoyment of it for sure. Before we moved into 2024, I remember hearing a lot of larger creators here on YouTube that I like to watch say that 2023 was one of the best years for gaming and that 2024 is looking to be much the same way, but I honestly have to heavily disagree. For every game that comes out and ends up being a slam dunk, it feels like 9 more releases are either broken or riddled with greedy business practices, and I think it's making the future of this hobby look pretty bleak. What do you think though? Do you think that I'm being too negative, or do you think I hit the nail on the head here? Please feel free to discuss in the comments section down below. I do try my best to read every single one of them. I appreciate you all for taking the time out of your day to watch this video, and if you enjoyed it, please feel free to hit that like and subscribe button if you want to stick around. Until next time, everybody, I will catch you all later.